All right, we're going to try another problem. And this time, instead of doing arctan or inverse tan, we're going to do inverse sine. If you remember from first semester, we had 1 over the square root of 1 minus x squared was the derivative of inverse sine. Or we actually had du over square root of 1 minus u squared. So we're going to try to get this to look like this guy right here. And that seems like a daunting task, but we're going to follow the same steps that we did in example number 1. So remember, we are trying to get this to be a perfect square trinomial. So the first thing I'm going to do, the thing we always do with factoring is we factor out the negative. So the very first thing I'm going to do is factor out the negative so that it looks like this. Now, this is not a perfect square, so we got to figure out what's the perfect square that's going to make this a perfect square trinomial. The way to do that is to take this center number, divide it by 2. Here comes my number, and I square this number, and I get 36. So take the b value, divide by 2, take that and square it, and we get 36. So in the next step, I rewrite that exact same thing, 1 over the square root of negative parentheses x squared minus 12x plus 36 minus 36 plus 32, because we don't want to change the value, so we're just reintroducing this. We're going to add it, subtract it. Now, that right there is my perfect square trinomial, which I can write as a binomial squared. So I'm allowed to write this as x minus 6 squared. And it, basically, whatever number comes when you divide by 2, that's the number that goes in parentheses. So we get the following: the square root of the negative parentheses x minus 6 squared minus 4. Now, do you remember what we did in example number 1 when we had this? Because we're trying to get it to say 1 on the inside. So how can we get it to say 1? Well, we're going to divide that whole bottom row by 4. Okay, so it looks like that little bit of a mess because I kind of scrabbled. So I have negative, which is that. I'm going to divide this guy by 4. I'm going to divide this by 4. So if you're having trouble reading it, it says minus 1. You can maybe see I forgot to divide, wrote minus 4 underneath. So here's a minus 1. And then you might be wondering, where did that 1/2 come from? Well, I divided by 4 on the inside, but notice that this was a square root of 4. So when I'm like doing that, I need to pull that 1/2 on the outside. The 2 in the denominator comes from the square root of 4 that I just kind of introduced into the problem. Okay, guys, what can I do next? Well, if you remember, 4 is the same thing as 2 squared, so rather than have it outside of the parentheses, let's put it on the inside of the parentheses. So there we go. We have 1/2. We have 1 over the square root of negative, and then the parentheses, the quantity x minus 6 over 2 squared minus 1. Now, ladies and gentlemen, again, we are trying to get it to look like this. So how can I get it to look like this? Well, I divided by 4. I got this to this particular portion. If I distribute this negative, this parentheses becomes negative, and this becomes positive. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to distribute this negative, and then I'm going to flip the order. So this parentheses is negative. This becomes positive. I'm going to put the positive number first. Aha! Doesn't that look kind of like 1 over the square root of the quantity 1 minus something squared? And let's not forget our beautiful dx, which I seem to be forgetting quite a lot today. All right, so with that being said, we got it to where we wanted to get it, which was u substitution. So let's do u substitution together. We get u equals x minus 6 over 2. I want to remind you that that is the same thing as having 1/2 x minus 6 over 2, which is 3. So if I ask you to take the derivative of that, that is quite simply 1/2 dx. I always like to show that step that means dx is the same thing as du divided by 1/2. And we know dividing by 1/2 is the same thing as multiplying by 2. So we have that. So what happens when we set this up over here? Well, we have our antiderivative. We have a 1 at the top. We have a square root. We have a 1. We have a minus. We call that thing inside the parentheses u, and we're squaring it. And we just said that dx is the same thing as 2 du. Well, I'm going to put that 2 on the outside, and there was already a 1/2. So 2 times 1/2 It's going to be 1, so that 2 over 2 is going to go away. And check that out. 1 over the square root of 1 minus u squared. What does that say over there? 1 over the square root of 1 minus x squared. So the antiderivative of this is going to be inverse sine. So let's do that. And putting this over here. Whoops, I'm focused on the wrong thing here. Let's scroll down. Sorry about these amazing production values. So the 2 over 2 is just 1. And then we have inverse sine of u plus c, and to finish this puppy out, inverse sine of what u was, which it was x minus 6 over 2 plus c. Excellent.